the spiritual formation of lay Catholics involved in this work. They had to be good Catholics, inverted commas. In practical terms, that meant seeing that they attended to Bible study, frequented the sacraments, especially Sunday Mass and confession, studied church teaching, and developed their prayer life, saying the Rosary regularly, for instance, or on occasionally going on retreats.
The good Catholic was someone who kept the rules very precisely. I mean, not even a morsel of meat on Fridays, for example. And wouldn't be late for Mass and wouldn't leave before the Mass was over, and would be deferential, if not even subservient. Some might even say sycophantic towards the clergy. And the good Catholic would do what the Church expected him to do, and would be a humble person, and therefore not somebody who would put forward his views in opposition to the views that he was getting from a priest or bishop. So the bad Catholic, on the other hand, was somebody who was a bit of a troublemaker, a bit perhaps awkward, who would challenge things. And the bad Catholic was actually a very bad Catholic, because he was very liable to commit mortal sins and not to know he'd done it. And so he was he was beyond the pale in many respects. So there was this terrible fear of the bad Catholic, if you like, the enemy within kind of concept. And a lot of the way in which the laity were regarded by the official church was about this dichotomy between the good Catholic and the bad Catholic.
She was a tireless advocate of the importance of the Catholic Church taking the laity seriously, developing a proper understanding in the Church of the laity's appropriate role. It is right that this lecture is also one of a series to mark the 50th anniversary of the start of the Second Vatican Council, to remind ourselves of what the Council achieved in this area.
Well, I think it's best put in the words of Bishop Gilly Young, who was Bishop of Hobart, who attended the Second Vatican Council, and he described the church as a rather sort of ramshackle coach with people on top, people hanging onto the side, people running after it, people, a rather untidy but still proceeding ahead at a speed, but not in an orderly way. And I think this was his model for a mature church. In other words, he thought the church could be too tidy, it could be over-organised, it needed to be recognised that human life isn't like that. And you've got people travelling at different speeds. I also like the metaphor that Cardinal Basil Hume came up with of a caravan strung out across the desert, a pilgrimage strung out across the desert. Some at the front, the zealots saying, let's go faster, and some at the back saying, slow down, we can't keep up. And some people wandering off in different directions looking for other ways forward, and no one altogether sure where they're going. But that's a kind of model of a post-Vatican II church, which is a model of much less organisation, but it is much closer to reality.
The publication of the encyclical Humanae Vitae in the summer of 1968 saw an immediate and strong reaction as laity and priests up and down England and Wales went public to declare their opposition to, and indeed support for, the encyclical, what the encyclical had to say about birth control.
I think I'm in two minds about whether the issues that arose in 1968 were really as important as they seemed at the time. And I think that the historical verdict of Catholics now is that they were not. I came across a group of young Catholics the other day, very devout, regular attenders at Mass. They were engaged in some project organised by the hierarchy. Half of them had never heard of Humanae Vitae. And I explained it to them, and none of them agreed with it. But it didn't matter to them very much. It was at the very fringe of their awareness of what Catholicism is about. Now, I'm sure an ultra-conservative would say that's outrageous, and the bishops ought to have been shouting at them all the time about birth control and contraception and the rest of it. But I think the reality is that most priests don't mention it. So it has in fact slipped down and is not now regarded as central, whereas in 1968 it was regarded almost as the acid test of a good Catholic versus a bad Catholic. Now, I think possibly we have become more mature by realising that this was, in a way, not anything like the key issue that it seemed to be at the time. It was an attempt by the Church to assert its policy, its authority, in an area which was very unlikely to succeed. I don't think it knew that it was unlikely to succeed, and it was really shocked by the failure of the policy. There was a kind of shudder went through the entire hierarchy. Pope Paul VI, for example, the author of the encyclical, never issued another encyclical. And he seemed, among many people who knew him, to go into a state of depression from then until the end of his life. So it did have a very severe effect in people. What's gone wrong? Why have the wheels fallen off? We didn't know this was going to happen. We thought the ruling would come out and everybody would say, yes, sir. And they didn't.
So where do we turn? I think a clue comes later in this document, where it states that individual men and their associations cultivate in themselves the moral and social virtues and promote them in society. But it does not say what those virtues are.
My view is that if you talk to Catholics of a certain kind, progressive Catholics in Australia, England, United States, etc., a lot of their conversation is how the hierarchy have got it wrong, or the hierarchy are too conservative. And I don't think that's really enough as the content of an active religion which is committed to the gospel. And I think there has to be something much more positive to it. It's anemic and it's destructive, it's negative. And I think we need to find some way in which we can return to the core script, if you might call it, and stop this assumption of the life of the Catholic nowadays is all about confrontation with authority. Now, those issues don't go away, but I think there needs to be a much stronger sense of purpose to the Church. Now, the lay apostolate model of the laity taking instructions from priests and bishops can't be gone back to, that's dead. What I do think is that there is a new way forward, and that way forward is by understanding or rediscovering a philosophy of virtue that places virtue at the centre of the Christian life, as it was, incidentally, in the Middle Ages. It's the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, really, that put it on the back burner. I think we can begin to see in the recovery of a philosophy of virtue a considerable scope for moving forward and towards a much more mature understanding of what a lay vocation is like. And I think it's about returning to the Aristotelian virtues of courage, temperance, and so on, prudence and so on. And it's certainly also the three Pauline virtues of faith, hope and charity. Those seven together seem to me to be a model for a new, mature laity.
I think there's a great problem with teachings which the magisterium puts forward. And birth control would be a good example, but homosexuality is another area where it seems to me that the right way forward is intense debate, not silence, not closing it down, but get stuck in and argue it through.
I don't think that the Church is making any progress by trying to stop debate on certain issues. I mean, the correct response to a bad theological argument is a good theological argument, not to condemn the person who's promoted the bad theological argument or to get them sacked or in some other way to sanction them. There needs to be much more confidence in the ability of debate and the ability of theologians to arrive at the truth by a process of argument. The loss of confidence in the possibility that argument might lead forward, might lead to progress. That seems to me to be a great failure of trust, and reliance on sanctions from authority seems to me to represent a failure of trust, a failure of confidence that the arguments are good enough to stand on their own feet and to win the argument if they're good enough. Now, ordination of women is obviously a case in point where the Pope ruled not only the Catholic Church could not ordain women, didn't want to, but couldn't even if it did want to, if you like, but also said the debate must stop. Now, you can't do that in this modern world. You can't stop a debate by declaring that that's the end of it. You might want to try, but it doesn't get you anywhere, and the debate does go on and has gone on. Attempts to try and close it down, I think, are always going to be fruitless. They're going to absorb enormous amounts of energy. They're going to be a complete red herring. They're going to stand in the way of the Church doing its proper job, which is promoting the gospel.
I don't think it's impossible to imagine that cycle is still present in the Catholic Church. So there are going to be ups and downs, and there are going to be times when the Catholic Church is disloyal to its own truth, its own gospel. And there are going to be times when it is therefore being chastised, and it may well find pretty rough times. And a prophet may appear, or prophets may appear, that remind it of what its true purpose may be.
I think we move in historical cycles, 2 steps forward and 1.5 steps back, sometimes, unfortunately, 2.5 steps back. We go through periods of progress and periods of retreat. And these cycles are actually quite familiar over history. And often the retreats occur when the Church has started heading in the wrong direction in some way. It's conceived a false program, or it's actually allowed itself to be misled. And I'm wondering whether, in fact, we're going through a period now where the Church has made some mistakes and is suffering from them. And that's one of the reasons why all these other things we're talking about are occurring. It doesn't necessarily mean this is going to go on forever. It does mean that something will happen that will spur a realization of why we have got stuck, and why we are heading in all sorts of negative directions and unhelpful directions. So I think there is a possibility that the cycle might be coming to an end. I would define the cycle here as being Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, as to say Pope Benedict, who was after all very close to Pope John Paul II. The two of them, I think, need to be regarded as a single era in the history of the Catholic Church. And they're clearly coming to an end because the Pope cannot go on indefinitely. There's clearly sometime in the next, who knows, 2, 5, 10 years, going to be a papal election and a new Pope, a younger Pope with a different set of ideas, and that will mark the end of that era, and then we can see where we're going from there. And I suspect that one of the things we'd be hoping for, I'm hoping for certainly, is the Pope who recognises how deep these problems are and that he can't solve them on his own. And the best thing to do is to call the Church together in another ecumenical council, Vatican III if you like, you can hold it somewhere else if you want to, but we're an opportunity to really step back and say, well, these are big problems, how do we solve them together? And there could be the possibility of a leap forward of equal dimension to the leap forward that happened in the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965. And if that occurred, it would revolutionise the situation.